So when people say the firing squad is a more humane way to die,
There is nothing more humane about it. They don't know. This is not humane to anybody. It's not humane to Ronnie. It's not humane to the people that do it. It's, I mean, it's a terrible, terrible murder.
If you could choose the manner of your death, would you pick something that was immediate and certain, or something that might be more slow and more painful? I want you to hold on to that thought for a quick second, because it's going to be the question that's going to open up today's conversation. Today, we're talking about a Georgia death row inmate who asked the state for an old-fashioned firing squad instead of the standard lethal injection as a way to die. He isn't chasing drama or the headlines. He doesn't want a spectacle. At least, according to him, the medical realities of his body make an IV more likely to fail, or worse, to cause real, slow, painful suffering. Federal courts recently denied this request, but the moral question that he raised doesn't go away. This isn't just about different methods of execution. It forces us into an uncomfortable intersection of law, medicine, and morality. It rips open a messier debate. What does humane even mean when the state is ending a life? Who really gets to decide? The person whose life is ending, or the system that's carrying out the sentence? Do we treat the condemned as people with agency and free will, or rather as objects whose suffering doesn't matter because the sentence must be carried out? Now, when you say this out loud, people are split. Some hear agency and mercy, while others recoil at the image and say some things should never be sanitized. There's a quieter, darker piece to it too. How easily we stop seeing people on death row as people at all. When someone says, "I'll accept death, but I want it this way," you're forced into a rare conversation about dignity, control, and whether mercy can exist inside punishment. Is allowing a quicker death compassion, or another act of control dressed up as kindness? Now, people from all sides of the spectrum, whether you're pro or against the death penalty entirely, answer that question very differently. Now, if you were told you could choose exactly how you would die, painless and immediate, or slow and uncertain, what would you choose? And more importantly, who gets to decide for you when the state says your life can be taken? We're not just talking about method, we're talking about agency, justice, and whether a civilization that claims to be humane can square that claim with what it permits. Because one thing is certain, when your fate is sealed, there's no turning back. The gavel has fallen. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. Now, before we dive into today's case, I think it's worth stepping back and asking, how did we even get here? How did America, and specifically the state of Georgia, arrive at a place where an inmate is asking to be executed or killed by a firing squad rather than by the standard lethal injection? Now, as we know, the death penalty itself isn't new. In fact, it's as old as civilization itself. The very few written laws of execution date all the way back to the 18th century. And when European settlers came to the New World, they brought capital punishment with them. The very first execution in the colonies happened in 1608 in Jamestown, Virginia. And Georgia, well, like most of the colonies at the time, we had our own grim history of executions as well. Public hangings became the main method of execution here. And as we know, those weren't quiet, private affairs. They were spectacles, they were big deals. Whole towns gathered to watch a condemned person's final moments, final breath. Crowds cheering, sometimes bringing their own children along to watch, as if it were a county fair. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was theater. A person's last breath was just part of the show. And hanging wasn't the only way. Records in Georgia show people were burned at the stake, executed by firing squads, even punished in ways that feel more medieval rather than American. But it all happened right here in the Peach State. Well, now let's fast forward to the 20th century. Georgia traded the gallows for the electric chair. And from 1924 to 1998, over 400 people died in that very chair, in what our state has now nicknamed Old Sparky. Today, the original electric chair sits on display at the Georgia State Prison in Reidsville, like a museum piece. It's history. You can visit it. But let's not kid ourselves. That history isn't so ancient. The electric chair was still in use up until 2001, when the Georgia Supreme Court finally ruled it as cruel and unusual punishment. But think about that. 2001. That's just over 20 years ago. Barely 2 decades ago, the electric chair still claimed lives right here in Georgia. And now we're in the age of lethal injection, the most common method of execution right here in the US. Now, lethal injection is framed as the more humane method, the modern, sanitized way of carrying out the death penalty here in the States. No crowds, no spectacle. Just a clinical procedure behind closed doors. As we know, lethal injection isn't just one drug. It's usually a mix of 3, a cocktail. One to knock the person out, one to stop their breathing, and the final one to stop their heart. In theory, it's supposed to be quick and painless. But here's the problem. Lethal injection doesn't always go as planned. Just like everything, things can go wrong. There are botched executions. IVs that don't take, drugs that don't work as they are intended to, turning what was supposed to be painless, or again, the idea of what is more humane, into prolonged painful suffering. And when that happens, this debate reignites. One reason some inmates, like today's case, are asking for alternatives like the firing squad entirely. And here's the thing, even with lethal injection being billed as the more modern, humane method, it still goes wrong. And let's take what just happened in Idaho in 2024. One of the country's longest serving death row inmates, 73-year-old convicted murderer Thomas Creech, was wheeled into the execution chamber at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution in February 2024, awaiting his execution. Now, the plan was intended to be lethal injection, but the medical team tried 8 times to find a vein, arms, legs, even his feet, but nothing worked. And then nearly an hour later, the warden finally called the entire execution off. Idaho hadn't executed anyone in over a decade at this point, and this was supposed to be their very first. But instead, it turned into a public embarrassment and, more importantly, reminding the public just how fragile this so-called humane system really is.
I fully believed that I'm gonna die.
Thomas Creech expected to take his final breath.
I had convinced myself that that was it. So they came in to the death cell, handcuffed me, strapped me to the board, and then they put me on a gurney and they wheeled me in to the execution room. They started adjusting my hands and legs to strap me down. And then the warden told them to go ahead and proceed with the execution. I looked over to the right and I saw my wife sitting there. She had the most devastating, horrible, terrorized look on her face that I have ever seen in my life.
His wife, Leanne, was crying, sitting next to his priest. His son was there. Creech says he looked mad.
They started in my right arm, up by my elbow, and that was the first place that they poked me. I could feel it.
Creech remembers a total of 10 attempts, but IDOC says they tried and failed 8 times to establish an IV line where they'd inject pentobarbital into Creech's veins.
I don't know if it was wishful thinking or I actually saw, but I thought I saw angels standing on each side of my bed. And I think I started crying, and I pointed up to the sky and told my wife I was sorry.
Creech tells me his veins collapsed, meaning the veins' walls squeezed shut, preventing blood from flowing through. Just under an hour later, at 10:58 a.m., IDOC leaders announced they were halting the execution.
What they encountered in some instances was an access issue, but in others where they could establish access, They were unable, it was a vein quality issue that made them not confident in their ability to administer chemicals through the IV site once established.
My thought was just a divine intervention. It's the only thing I could think of. Otherwise, I would have been dead. I believe it was God Almighty that had his hand in it, that stopped it.
You have bad veins. Like, this is something that eye doc knew, and this is a health issue you have, correct?
They've known this forever. Even when they did blood draws on me for diabetes and stuff, they had a hard time accessing the veins. So my attorneys had warned them about this, but apparently they didn't take it to heart.
Since the failed execution,
It's really bad.
Creech says his health deteriorated.
Some days I'm not even sure if I'm going to live to the next day. I continue to have the nightmares. One of the dreams I have is I wake up and I'm back on that table again. And they're standing around me, putting the needles at it.
Thomas Creech's lawyers called it exactly what it looked like, a botched execution attempt. Now, they argued it proved that the state couldn't guarantee a constitutional, let alone a compassionate, death.
Shortly after the failed execution, Creech's legal team filed a motion to stay his execution again.
Yeah, in a statement, they said in part, quote, "We are angered but not surprised that the state of Idaho botched the execution of Thomas Creech today. This is what happens when unknown individuals with unknown training are assigned to carry out an execution." They went on to say, "This is precisely the kind of mishap we warned the state and the courts could happen when attempting to execute one of the country's oldest death row inmates in circumstances completely shielded in secrecy, despite a well-known history of getting drugs from shady sources." You can read their entire statement on our website, ktvb.com.
Okay, so Creech's legal team called the execution botched. However, during the news conference this afternoon, IDOC pushed back on that term, botched, instead calling it unsuccessful.
This isn't a do-it-at-any-cost process. That our first objective is to carry this out with dignity, professionalism, and respect. When it reaches a point in that process, at any step, where it looks like we're going to be unable to do that, that's when we call it off. It wasn't a difficult decision. It was the right decision.
Governor Brad Little issued a statement about the execution. He said in part the team of professionals at IDOC was prepared for the possibility that medical professionals would not be able to access the inmate's veins, a circumstance that has occurred in execution procedures elsewhere in the country. The competent and qualified medical professionals present and IDOC officials were cautious and did the right thing in not moving forward with this execution.
Idaho's Attorney General Raul Labrador also issued a statement about the failed execution. He said in part, quote, "Justice has now been delayed again following the medical inability to execute Thomas Creech. Today is a sad day for the families of his victims and a continuation of the pain they have endured for almost 5 decades."
Meanwhile, the ACLU released a statement as well. It says in part, quote, "The failed execution of Thomas Creech calls attention to additional reasons why the government should not be in the business of executing."
And honestly, when you hear that, you start to see why an inmate might look at lethal injection and say, "No thanks, give me something fast," even if it sounds brutal. Because slow, failed attempts like that, they raise the very question we're wrestling with today. If death is certain, shouldn't how it's carried out matter? And here's a detail that makes it even harder to ignore. Idaho's own execution protocol allows a team to be made up of entirely volunteers. Now think about that, volunteers. And the only requirement, just 3 years of medical experience. They don't even have to be doctors. So when you hear that a 73-year-old man was strapped to a gurney while strangers in masks poked him with needles over and over for over an hour, it makes you question the whole idea of humane executions entirely. Is this really a medical procedure, or is it theater, like it was back in the day, dressed up to look clinical? But Idaho's case wasn't the only recent botched execution attempt. Alabama has been at the center of some of the most disturbing episodes in modern death penalty history. And Alan Miller's story is a striking example of this. Alan Miller was convicted of killing 3 men in 1999 and then sentenced to death. But back in 2022, the state tried and failed to execute him by lethal injection. Sound familiar? Leaving him strapped to a gurney for hours while staff jabbed his body in search of a vein. Now, he survived, but Alabama wasn't done with carrying out his execution. 2 years later, in September 2024, Alan Miller was finally executed by the method of nitrogen hypoxia, which was only the second time this untested method had been used in the US history. In fact, Alan's was actually the second execution in both the world and Alabama in particular to use this particular method. Witnesses described Alan Miller shaking and gasping for air for several minutes before he was pronounced dead. His final words were, "I didn't do anything to be here." Now, execution by nitrogen hypoxia basically means the inmate breathes in pure nitrogen instead of air. Now, without oxygen, your body will eventually shut down, but how fast or smooth that happens can vary person to person.
But I want to bring in someone who knows a lot about this case. Dr. Jonathan Groner is a professor emeritus of surgery at the Ohio State University College of Medicine. He's been studying executions extensively, traveling to death row in multiple states and examining inmates whose executions were botched. Doctor, it's really good to have you. Jesse Hoffman is arguing that nitrogen hypoxia is going to interfere with his Buddhist breathing, make him claustrophobic, and worsen his PTSD. Can you explain to me exactly what happens when you're dying under the method of nitrogen hypoxia?
Well, nitrogen's not a poisonous gas. It's an inert gas. You're breathing it right now, so am I, about 78%. So the mask gives you 100% nitrogen, so you don't get any oxygen. I can't comment on the Buddhism and the PTSD, but I can comment on is that as long as you hold your breath, you won't die. So some of the other people have tried to hold breath holding for extremely long time, which is extremely painful. And then sudden fall in oxygen causes a seizure. And when people have witnessed these executions and seen people shaking violently, I suspect they were having grand mal seizures. So it's a pretty ugly way to die. I can't tell exactly what the person's experiencing. I don't think it's good. It does take some time. The firing squad, which I think is what he preferred, would be a lot quicker. We had an experience that last week where a doctor examined someone, I think within 3 minutes of the execution, and found that the person was dead.
Now, this execution came just months after the state executed Kenneth Eugene Smith, the first person ever put to death by nitrogen gas. The first person in the world actually to be executed by this method. Now, according to witnesses, Kenneth Smith convulsed violently on the gurney for more than 2 minutes, shaking so hard that the gurney had moved, then gasped for air until he finally went still. Until finally his heart stopped. Alabama officials brushed this off as expected side effects, but critics, including Kenneth Smith's lawyers, human rights groups, and medical experts, said the scene looked more like torture, not the painless death that the state had promised or intended.
But for more, we're joined by Kenneth Eugene Smith's spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, who says it was the most horrible thing I've ever seen. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jeff. So you were there watching Smith die, watching him gas to death. Describe what you saw. And we realize this is not easy. You are just coming off of this execution.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you so much. Like I said, it was the most horrific thing I've ever seen. I mean, the gas mask fits from the top of the head to under the chin. It's looks like a firefighter's mask. Once the execution began, it was very clear that Kenny was suffering immensely. He begins to pump back and forth. It really looked like a fish out of water, a fish on a dock. As he pumps back and forth, the gurney was shaking. Very clear he was resisting or pushing against the restraints. Every time he pushed forward, His face would thrust into the mask. The mask was tied to the gurney by two, short, small pieces of material. So every time he came forward, his face would slam into the front of the mask. And there was spit, mucus, all sorts of fluids coming out of his mouth, and it was hitting the front of the mask. And so what that looked like was, mucus, and these fluids were streaming down the mask. He was very clearly in unbelievable duress. His face was turning purple and red. His eyeballs looked like they were about to pop out. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible, and it was shocking that this is taking place in a nation that prides itself on being one of the human rights leaders of the world.
Now, the state of Alabama started using nitrogen gas for executions, mainly because they were running out of the cocktail of drugs, needed for lethal injections, and because lethal injections hadn't always gone so smoothly. Officials consider nitrogen hypoxia to be a more humane form, claiming the person would quickly lose consciousness and die without pain. Or that's what they claim, that's the intention. Now, on the other hand, the UN Human Rights Office says this form of execution could also, strikingly enough, account to torture. And according to those who witnessed the executions of Kenneth Smith and Alan Miller, who were both seen shaking, convulsing, and gasping for air, it's far from a guaranteed painful death. And even up until Kenneth Smith's execution, executing someone by this method had not been tested at all. So basically, Kenneth Smith was the guinea pig for this method and type of execution. And as you can imagine, both executions have fueled fierce debate, especially in more recent years. Alabama insists nitrogen hypoxia is more humane and textbook, but what witnesses actually saw was prolonged suffering, thrashing, and panic, the very opposite of what the state had claimed. Even veterinarians in the US refuse to use nitrogen on most animals because many consider it to be inhumane. Yet Alabama is pressing forward, signaling more nitrogen executions to come in the future, possibly becoming the state's main form of execution rather than lethal injection in upcoming years.
To my colleagues across the country, many of which were watching last night, Alabama has done it, and now so can you. And we stand ready to assist you in implementing this method in your states.
Now, here's a fact that punches through all the euphemisms. Of all execution methods used right here in the US, lethal injection has the highest botch rate out of all of them, roughly 7%, while death by firing squads recorded botch rate is, as you can imagine, effectively 0%. As one can, like I said, easily imagine why. Those numbers come from long-term tallies of executions and botched attempts over the years and decades. Let's put it bluntly. The method most Americans picture as quiet, modern, and clinical is statistically the one most likely to go wrong. The method most people picture as archaic and violent and, let's face it, rather barbaric, the firing squad, has the best track record for actually doing what it's meant to do without prolonged suffering for the condemned. Now, knowing that, it's not some irrational shock or idea when an inmate looks at an IV, thinks about the horror stories, and asks for a rifle or to be shot point blank instead.
I mean, from all, indications and experts, it seems that the firing squad, as macabre as it seems, is the least painful or lengthy way to die. With nitrogen hypoxia, how long can it take, does it take, and have you seen it before, and is it often botched?
So, first of all, I don't call it hypoxia, I call it nitrogen suffocation. Hypoxia is a low oxygen level, and a lot of people actually live that way due to heart problems or lung problems, but it is a suffocation. So it's a little bit more like waterboarding. Whereas like the firing squad is obviously very fast. I doubt someone actually feels a lot during a firing squad. By the time they recognize that they've been shot, they probably are already unconscious. So, and I've seen when people hold their breath for a long time, they get something called pulmonary edema. I've seen that in patients, and that's a terrible thing to see, very frightening, and also quite ugly. So, the question to me is why nitrogen when there are other ways that are more obviously available?
I was more curious about how long it takes.
I could just say several minutes. Lethal injections have sometimes taken up to 2 hours because they can't get the IVs in. That's not happened with nitrogen. I think, maybe 10 minutes. I'm not sure. I have not witnessed one, but it's sort of in the medium range. Firing squad is seconds. Lethal injection would be hours. Nitrogen appears to be somewhere in the middle. But obviously they don't go quietly. I will say that.
So when a man on Georgia's death row tells the state, don't give me lethal injection, give me the firing squad, he isn't necessarily choosing the more brutal or savage method to die. Rather, he's choosing reliability over risk, immediacy over the possibility of a slow, agonizing failure. Now, this flips the usual moral framing on its head. Sometimes the so-called modern humane option might be the least humane of all. Currently, only 5 states in the US allow the firing squad to be even considered as a method or option of execution: Idaho, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Utah, and South Carolina, not Georgia. And this isn't just a relic of the past. It's actually making a comeback. In March of 2025, Idaho Governor Brad Little even signed a bill making the firing squad the state's primary and preferred method of execution, the first state in the country to do so. This law will take effect July 1st, 2026, and was prompted mainly because of that failed lethal injection attempt on Thomas Creech back in February 2024. And even before Idaho established the firing squad as their preferred method of execution, it was still being used in practice. Rarely, but it was still being used. Let's take South Carolina, for example. Now, just recently, 42-year-old Michael Medee, convicted of killing an off-duty police officer back in 2004, chose to die by firing squad instead of lethal injection or even the electric chair. Michael was executed by a 3-person firing squad this year. But according to his legal team, the execution was botched. Michael's attorneys claim that only 2 of the bullets actually struck him and that they largely missed his heart, which is the intended target. Now, because of this, his attorneys say, the condemned suffered just long enough to violate constitutional law against what is considered to be cruel and unusual punishment. Thus why he chose death by firing squad rather than lethal injection in the first place. Witnesses say Michael cried out as the shots hit him and his arms flexed and tensed. A target with a bullseye was placed over his heart, which is instructed in executions that are performed by a firing squad. Michael supposedly groaned for about 80 seconds before he took his final breath. A doctor pronounced him dead less than 4 minutes after the shots were fired. His choice was seen as the quickest and most reliable way to die. A controlled, certain end at a moment when lethal injection has become increasingly unpredictable. And Michael was actually the second person to choose to be executed by a firing squad in South Carolina this year, 2025. Earlier in 2025, South Carolina executed Brad Sigmund in the first U.S. firing squad execution in nearly 15 years. And historically, the other recent U.S. firing squad executions all took place in the state of Utah. These examples show us that, though rare, firing squads are not unknown, and in the eyes of some inmates, they are the method with the lowest chance of pain or error. South Carolina actually passed a law back in 2021 that allowed death row inmates to choose their method of execution, either lethal injection, the electric chair, or firing squad. Initially, many inmates challenged this new law, but the state Supreme Court affirmed this legality of a firing squad in 2024 on the basis that a person be shot directly in the heart so that they would not suffer longer than 15 seconds before going unconscious. A South Carolina reporter told the Associated Press the scene looked like this. Brad Sigmund was wearing a white target over his chest, and after he made his final statement, officials put a hood over his face and then a black shade opened to reveal the 3 volunteer shooters. And with no countdown or warning, the abrupt crack of rifles cut through the execution chamber. And within minutes, a doctor checked him and pronounced him dead.
Let's go right now to News Nation's Alex Capriello, live for us in Columbia, South Carolina. Alex, this is actually the first firing squad execution ever in the state of South Carolina.
Yeah, that's right, Elizabeth. All eyes on South Carolina, especially considering what we know about lethal injection and the troubles that American Department of Corrections have had in actually procuring those drugs. They wanted to see how this execution unfolded, specifically since we haven't seen one in America for the last 15 years, the last one being Ronnie Lee Gardner. I actually spoke to his brother just this morning, and he had a lot to say certainly about that. But as far as what's happening here with Brad Sigmund, it's clear that while he chose the firing squad as his method of execution, it did not come without troubles. His attorney telling me that the electric chair greatly frightened him, as well as some of the botched attempts of lethal injection in the past. That being said, Brad Sigmund, I'm told, has turned his life to Christ and for the last 24 years has been practicing his faith from inside these jail cells, acting as a sort of minister to these other inmates that are on death row. And most certainly, when we heard what his last words were, it reflects that. It was very biblically based. It incorporated a lot of scripture readings. That final words read by the attorney to the witnesses, a part of that gallery, and shared with us just moments ago. Take a listen to the final words of 67-year-old Brad Sigmund. Take a listen.
I want my closing statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty. An eye for an eye was used as justification to the jury for seeking the death penalty. At that time, I was too ignorant to know how wrong that was.
After we heard those final words, we had 3 media witnesses who were allowed inside that gallery to see exactly how this unfolded. They shared the details of what Sigmund looked like in those final moments, the sort of mannerisms and behaviors he displayed to both his attorney and the rest of the gallery, what he was wearing, what it sounded like when those shots rang out. Here's one AP reporter explaining what he saw in those moments.
A prison employee lifted up the shade. And then from that point, it was a little less than 2 minutes of nothing at that moment. I mean, you could see Brad Sigmund took several pretty deep breaths, and then suddenly the shots rang out at, I believe Christy said it was 6:05 and 50 seconds. At that point, you did see a small red stain on Sigmund's chest.
Relative to lethal injection, a firing squad death is much quicker. We've had lethal injections in this country that have lasted over 2 hours because executioners have been trying to find a correct vein. There have been problems with the drugs. The inmate is simply not dying.
For over 25 years, Fordham Law professor Deborah Deno has studied America's repeated attempts to find humane ways to execute criminals.
A firing squad sounds pretty grisly, frankly. Does that make sense as a method for the 21st century?
There have only been 2 botches of firing squad executions and, a sample of 144 civilian executions over the course of this country's history. Both of those botches would not happen in the present day. One was because the inmate was intoxicated and moving so much that the target got displaced. In another case, the executioners purposely shot in the side of the inmate's body because they wanted that inmate to suffer. Again, we wouldn't see those kinds of incidences today.
So when you combine the botched execution rates of lethal injection with the reliability of a firing squad, it's pretty easy to understand why someone on death row might ask for a rifle, as I mentioned, instead of a needle. It's not about spectacle. It's about certainty, control, and avoiding a slow, agonizing, painful death. Choosing a firing squad may seem extreme to many, but when the odds of a painful, failed execution are that high, it's understandable why an inmate might ask for the control and speed over their method of death. And that brings us right here to Georgia. The story of Michael Nance, a death row inmate who shines a very spotlight on this tension in question. Michael Nance argued that Georgia's lethal injection protocol could cause him unbearable pain due to his medical complexities and conditions, and he actually won the right to challenge this protocol all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. His case forced the state and the courts to confront a very fundamental question. If the state is going to take a life, shouldn't the condemned have some say in how it's carried out? Ultimately, though, a judge denied his request, leaving lethal injection as the current method for his execution. So now, let's get into the details surrounding Michael Nance's case, what led him to the death row in the first place, why he made this unusual request, and why his fight captured the attention of advocates, legal experts, and the public alike. Michael Wayne Nance didn't land on death row overnight. His path there started back in December of 1993 with a desperate and reckless attempt at a bank robbery in Gwinnett County, Georgia. On the morning of December 18th, 1993, Michael stole a 1980 Oldsmobile Omega and drove to the Tucker Federal Savings and Loan Bank in Lilburn, Georgia. He walked inside the bank wearing a ski mask and gloves, holding a .22 caliber revolver. He was carrying 2 pillowcases that he expected to leave stuffed with cash. He threatened the tellers, warning them not to slip in any die packs or he'd kill them. But the tellers, doing what they were trained to do, managed to sneak a couple in there anyway. Now, if you're anything like me, you might be wondering, what exactly is a die pack? I actually didn't know until I started digging into this case myself. I had never heard of it before. Basically, it looks just like a stack of cash, but it's actually a small security device designed to look like a stack of real cash that tellers slip into money during a robbery. Then, once the robber leaves, the die pack is triggered and it explodes, spraying bright-colored, permanent ink all over the bills and oftentimes the robber themselves. Some die packs even release tear gas to make it harder for the robber to get away. The whole point is to ruin the money so that it can't be spent and to mark the suspects so police can catch and identify them more easily. So after Michael stole the money and got back into his getaway car to try to flee, those die packs just so happened to explode, spewing red ink and tear gas everywhere. That's when his plan unraveled instantly. He ditched the car, leaving behind the stained money and his mask, and ran, gun still in hand. Then, in the midst of all this chaos, he stumbled into a nearby liquor store parking lot where 2 men, just regular bystanders, happened to be. One of them, Gaber below, was just backing his car out of a parking spot when Michael Nance ran up, yanked open his driver's side door, and shoved himself inside. Witnesses said the innocent bystander screamed, "No, no," trying to push himself away while still behind the wheel. But Michael instead pulled the trigger, striking the man. The bullet tore into the man's arm, tore into his chest, and fatally pierced his heart. He died almost instantly, slumped in the driver's seat before help could arrive. But Michael's path of destruction didn't stop there. He then turned the gun on another man, Dan McNeil, demanding his car keys. When that man, Dan, tried to run away, Michael shot at him, ultimately missing him before running away from the scene. Eventually, Michael ended up at a nearby gas station where things escalated into a tense, hour-long standoff with police. He held the gun to his own head and warned officers, "If anyone rushes me, there's going to be war." However, after negotiations, he eventually surrendered to officers. At trial, prosecutors painted a clear picture. Not only was Michael Nance guilty of a robbery gone wrong, but he was also guilty of murder, aggravated assault, attempted armed robbery, and more. And the jury found him guilty on all counts. What ultimately sealed his fate, though, were 2 aggravating factors. He already had a serious criminal record, and he had killed an innocent man during the commission of another felony, which was the robbery. And it was that combination that convinced jurors to hand down the death penalty. And that's how Michael Nance ended up on death row right here in Georgia. Not just for a botched robbery, but for the murder of a man who just so happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. After Michael Nance was convicted, his legal team fought the death sentence through a series of appeals. Early on, the Georgia Supreme Court found a problem with the jury. One member wasn't properly qualified, so they actually overturned his death sentence and sent the case back for resentencing. But in 2002, Michael Nance was given the death sentence again, and this time the Supreme Court fully affirmed it. Michael tried to appeal again through a habeas corpus petition, arguing that his trial lawyers had been ineffective. But ultimately, the district court denied this petition, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit affirmed this ruling. And over the years, every major appeal and petition failed to overturn the outcome. His conviction stood, his death sentence stood, and the legal path for him to challenge it eventually ran out. Even after all his appeals and resentencing, Michael Nance wasn't done challenging the system. In January 2020, he filed a federal lawsuit arguing that Georgia's lethal injection protocol could subject him to unconstitutional pain because of 2 medical issues that he suffered from. According to Michael and his lawyers, his veins are severely compromised and extremely difficult to access. His lawyers argue that there is substantial risk that his veins could blow during an execution, causing the drug to leak into surrounding tissue and cause intense pain. Combined with medication he was taking in prison for chronic back pain, Michael Nance and his lawyers argue that an attempted lethal injection could go terribly wrong or botched, leaving him in excruciating pain for an extended period of time. His lawyers also argued his longtime use of medication for back pain could make the drugs used in lethal injections ineffective or overall less effective. So Michael asked for something rare and old-fashioned, the good old firing squad. Execution by firing squad is both swift and virtually painless, his lawsuit stated. He cited evidence and recent experience suggesting that the firing squad is significantly more reliable than lethal injection, especially in cases like his. Georgia courts initially dismissed the claims as untimely or without merit, and the state argued that firing squads are relatively uncommon and archaic. But the U.S. Supreme Court eventually intervened, reopening his case, and that's when the 11th Circuit agreed that Michael Nance had plausibly alleged that a firing squad could be a less painful and more reliable alternative. Judge Bill Pryor noted that if a state refuses a safer option without a legitimate reason, that refusal could itself be seen as cruel and unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment. So, in other words, Michael Nance's request wasn't performative. It was about reducing the risk of unnecessary suffering. And it forced Georgia courts to ask themselves, if an inmate is facing death anyway, shouldn't he or she have a say in how it's carried out? Thus, this is the backdrop for today's story. Michael Nance, the condemned man, the crime, and the fight over how his life will eventually end. Even after years of litigation, Michael Nance's fight over how he could be executed continued to wind its way through the court system. At the heart of his challenge was the claim that lethal injection could be very painful for him. In short, he argued that attempting lethal injection could amount to cruel and unusual punishment. When he first filed his lawsuit, he argued that execution by firing squad would be swift and virtually painless and far safer for him than lethal injection, given his compromised veins and the medication he takes for chronic back pain. But there's an important thing to mention in all this. Georgia isn't one of the 5 states that currently allows executions by firing squads at all. So Michael Nance's request wouldn't just be unusual, it would require either a legal exception or a change in state law for it to actually happen. Initially, courts pushed back, saying his request wasn't authorized under Georgia law and had to be considered as part of a habeas corpus petition. That procedural barrier blocked his claim, and a divided panel of the 11th Circuit upheld that dismissal, though one judge strongly dissented, noting the obvious risks Michael Nance could possibly face if lethal injection was attempted. This case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a tight 5-4 ruling, the court actually sided with Michael Nance, clarifying that a death row inmate can actually challenge the state's execution method through a civil rights lawsuit, even if that alternative method isn't currently being allowed by state law. Justice Elena Kagan, writing for the majority, emphasized that the inmate could technically argue the state's plan violates the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The dissent, led by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, argued that the court was overreaching because under Georgia law, lethal injection is the only authorized method. But with that decision, Michael regained the right to have his firing squad request reconsidered. The 11th Circuit then sent the case back to the federal district court in Georgia to determine whether the state could provide a legitimate reason why he must die by lethal injection or whether a firing squad, or even some other method would be constitutionally safer. Essentially, the courts recognize that even a condemned inmate has the right to challenge not just the fact of execution, but how it's being carried out. But then in early 2025, a federal judge ruled against Michael Nance. Michael Nance asked the U.S. District Judge to let him become the first person in Georgia's modern history to be legally executed by a firing squad. But the federal judge declined to do so, ending Michael Nance's case in early of this year. While the judge initially acknowledged the firing squad argument, he didn't need to weigh it because, at least according to him, Michael Nance hadn't provided significant proof that lethal injection would actually cause him any severe pain. The judge noted that medical records showed that the inmate had successfully undergone multiple IV procedures since filing his lawsuit, and experts admitted that the impact of his pain medication on the execution drug was uncertain. This particular judge noted that a doctor who testified for the state during a bench trial indicated that since this suit had been filed, Michael Nance had undergone 3 separate medical procedures that required an IV to be placed, and that there had been no problem thus far. In other words, the court said Michael Nance hadn't met the standard for providing a substantial risk of serious harm, which is technically required under the 8th Amendment. Plaintiff has failed to show that his execution by lethal injection under Georgia's protocol is substantially likely to result in his suffering an unconstitutional level of pain or discomfort, the judge stated. None of the evidence that plaintiff presented demonstrated that the state, through executing him under the protocol, would intensify the sentence of death with a cruel superaddition of terror, pain, or disgrace. And that's literally where we kind of stand today. Michael's lawyers, Anna Arsenio and Corey Isaacson, who is also the legal director of the ACLU of Georgia, said they plan to appeal the ruling to the Atlanta-based federal appeals court. His case, originally filed in January 2020, has already made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court once. And even over 5 years later, his fight isn't over yet, his team argues. But Michael Nance isn't the only Georgia death row inmate questioning the state's lethal injection protocol. Another prisoner, DeKelvin Raphael Martin, who was convicted of murdering his girlfriend's 12-year-old child along with her elderly grandparents and committing other serious crimes, is pursuing a similar legal challenge. Like Michael Nance, DeKelvin Martin is arguing that the current method could cause unconstitutional levels of pain, thus violating his constitutional rights. His case is now pending before a different federal judge in Atlanta. This shows the public that Michael Nance's fight is part of a larger conversation in Georgia about how executions are being carried out in the state and whether the state's only option, lethal injection, is truly as humane as the state claims it is. As of now, Michael Nance's team say his fight isn't over. Even though the firing squad option was not addressed because the federal judge ruled that the inmate hadn't proven lethal injection would cause him unusual pain, Michael's legal team plans to continue to pursue appeals, keeping the case alive and highlighting the ongoing debate over execution methods right here in the state of Georgia. However, as of the upload of this video, Michael Nance's ultimate fate remains uncertain, and he still currently remains on death row at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, awaiting his execution. As he remains on death row to this day, still fighting for an alternative method of execution, it forces the public to wonder, how do we as a society truly define what is cruel and unusual, and who truly is the one to decide?
Representative Paul Ray authored the bill that brought the firing squad back as an option in Utah in 2015, and has a bill on the floor right now that adds violent sex trafficking as a capital offense.
Would your guess be that firing squad is the most humane way to carry out capital punishment?
I think it is. I mean, if you look at the other options, hanging, electrocution, and lethal injection, this is obviously the quickest, most painless way to take somebody's life.
In Utah, lethal injection is still the primary execution method. Though they don't have the drugs on hand, they hope to find them before the next executions. Of the 9 men on death row in Utah right now, 3 say they prefer death by firing squad.
Is it ever kind of crazy as a lawmaker to be talking about what the best way is to take somebody's life.
You know, it's a big deal in Utah if we take somebody's life, and so we wanted to make sure that we were doing the things the right way, and I think by going back to what we've used, we know it works, and we've not ever had a problem with it. And these people that go to death row, they're monsters. I mean, they're not there because they sang too loud in the choir on Sunday. They're there because they killed somebody, and they're going to continue to kill people. So the only thing that we can do is terminate them.
Michael Nance's story is more than just a legal battle. It's a lens into the fraught, often messy reality of the death penalty, and not only right here in the state of Georgia, but throughout the United States. From botched lethal injections to debates over new forms of execution methods like nitrogen gas and firing squads, his fight forces the state and the public to ask a very difficult question. When the state decides how a life ends, what counts as humane and who gets to draw that line? His case has sparked fierce debate, dividing opinion not only across the courtroom, but in the broader public. Supporters of his argue that challenging lethal injection highlights serious flaws in the overall justice system, while opponents see requests like his and others as blatant attempts to delay justice and their executions ultimately. It's a conversation about ethics, law, and the very meaning of punishment, one that continues to polarize the nation. And this debate isn't just theoretical. Ronnie Lee Gardner, a convicted killer in Utah, was executed by firing squad in 2010. And the aftermath of that execution left scars far beyond the prison walls. His brother, still haunted by the images of his brother's body, is now fighting to end capital punishment in the state of Utah, especially by what he calls one of the most brutal methods imaginable. In his interview with Vice Media, he shared the graphic photographs of his brother's final moments, pictures so violent and raw, they leave little doubt about the cost of firing squads. And so the question remains, both for us and for society at large. If you had the power to decide your fate, which method would you choose? Would you go with the option that might be painless but carries a risk of complications, or the method where the odds of dying immediately are higher but less certain in other ways? Let us know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. Michael Nance's story isn't just a case file or a headline, it's a human life caught in the crosshairs of law, medicine, and morality. Every decision, every protocol, every contested drug carries weight far beyond the courtroom, touching on fear, pain, and the very essence of what it means to die under the state's hand. As he remains on death row to this day, challenging a system that wields life and death with the authority of law, we are left to wonder, how do we measure mercy, justice, and humanity? And if the roles were reversed, what choice would you make when the clock is ticking and the final decision isn't yours to control? Now, one thing is certain, Michael Nance remains on death row in Georgia, awaiting his final moments. But the legacy of his case and the way it exposes the deeply polarizing and morally complex nature of the death penalty overall will continue to spark debate and reflection across the state and the country for years to come.